大家晚上好. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Yale Center Beijing, Yale University's home here in China. I am Carol Rafferty, a Yale College alumna and also executive director of the center. Today, I'm also delighted to be and very honored to be welcoming our distinguished speakers and moderator, Professor Arne Westad from Yale University, joining us from online, and Professor Chen Jian joining us in person. He just flew back from Ithaca and is usually based at NYU Shanghai. So we're just so grateful to have them talk about their new book, fresh off the Yale University Press, called The Great Transformation, China's Road from Revolution to Reform. So before we start, I'm going to quickly introduce our very distinguished speakers and moderator briefly. Professor Arne Westad is a preeminent Cold War historian who is currently the Elihu Professor of History and Global Affairs at Yale University. He previously taught at the Harvard Kennedy School and the London School of Economics. He has had many seminal works, including The Global Cold War, which was an important piece of modern international history. And lately, he has put his focus on how China's economic reforms in the 20th century has changed the global economic landscape. Professor Chen Jian, who is now the Distinguished Global Network Professor at NYU Shanghai, and also head of the NYU Shanghai East China Normal University Center on Global History, Economy, and Culture. He was a named endowed professor at Cornell University in history, as well as the Philippe Ramond Chair in History and International Affairs at the London School of Economics. He is a preeminent historian in US-China relations, Cold War international history, and has many published works, such as China's Road to the Korean War, Mao's China and the Cold War, and has just written a very important political and diplomatic biography of Zhou Enlai, which we hope he will also come here to speak about in the very near future. And of course, we have Melinda Liu as our wonderful moderator today. As many of you know, she is the doyenne of the Foreign Press Corps in China. She came here in 1980 to open Newsweek's Beijing bureau and has been reporting here for almost 3 decades. She has also reported on crises and conflicts firsthand from Afghanistan, Haiti, Iraq, Kuwait, Somalia, you name it. She's a recipient of the Shorenstein Journalism Award for Outstanding Reporting in Asia. She's a documentary maker, the Doolittle Writers, a China story, and also a former head chairwoman of the Foreign Correspondent Club here in the early 2000s, and in addition, an editor of the Royal Asiatic Journal of Asia, China. So without further ado, this has been a mouthful because of how amazing these people are. We will have Melinda come up and moderate this very important discussion. Please welcome them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Chen. I've been waiting to meet you for such a long time, and we're honored to have you here. Good evening to everyone who's come, and especially to Arne. So great to see you. We've been great friends, but we haven't seen each other for a while, and thank you so much.
Far too long, Melinda, but it's good to see.
So why don't we jump right into it? I will probably ask you, Arne, first, and then Chen Jian, about what I found to be one of the central pillars and areas of exploration that the two of you delved into in your book. It's the question of how much of China's reform came from above, from the elite, and how much of it came bubbled up from below, from the ordinary people. Now, obviously, the big picture is that China has racked up an amazing economic miracle story. And even though recent years have presented economic challenges, overall, the numbers are still staggering. Now, I came away from the book with the overwhelming feeling, and I think you even stated it in the book, that this was due mainly to the ordinary people. That even though the book is called The Great Transformation, China's Road from Revolution to Reform, and the message that came across in your book to me is that the ordinary people were to be given the credit for the broad responsibility for this success. Now, how did the two of you come to this conclusion? Did one of you feel more that way than the other? Did you have to discuss it, or were you in complete agreement from the very beginning? Arne, what about you starting?
Well, we start by saying it's wonderful to be back at the Yale Center Beijing, although virtually. I would have loved to be there in person. That'll happen soon, I hope. And it's wonderful to see you again, Melinda, and to see Alan, and to see Carol. And of course, my dear friend, my brother, Chen Jian, with whom I wrote this book. So some people have been asking that question where you ended up, Melinda, saying, what is it like to write a book together? And the only thing I can say about that is it's just been a fantastic experience, because if you are to write a book with someone else, you have to pick someone who is not just a great person to work with, but also someone who is so profoundly knowledgeable about the topics that you're going to deal with as Chen Jian. So that has been a privilege. That's not the same thing as saying that we didn't have, and I think Chen Jian would agree with me on this, that we didn't have somewhat different focus points at times. I mean, I think overall, broadly speaking, we agreed on the approach that we're going to have on the book. But that's not the same thing as agreeing on everything, particularly in terms of explanations for the more specific aspects of what the book is about. On the question you asked, Melinda, is one that I sense, and it'd be interesting to hear what Chen Jian has to say, that we were in very broad agreement. Of course, it's both. I mean, of course, what happened at the top of the political system after what in effect was a military takeover in late 1976, also helped to set up the framework for what was to come later. But you're right. I mean, our core argument, in a way, in the book, or one of the most substantial arguments, is that reform from below started well before reform from above. That in some places in China, not everywhere, but in some significant parts of the country, in terms of what was to happen later, people had, out of desperation for the political, social, and economic cataclysms that they had gone through during the 1960s and early 1970s, they had taken upon themselves to try to make things better for themselves, for their families, first and foremost, for the villages and towns, and eventually for the country. Although I don't think the country figured very highly on their agenda when this started in the very early 1970s. I think they were out to save themselves after having really gone through hell since the early 1960s. Many of you will know this. I mean, even in rich areas of China, people had been starving during parts of that time. There was something profoundly wrong in how China was governed and how the economy was set up. And that was what people reacted against. I mean, Chinese are smart people. They know that if they are going to survive, if there is another round of this kind of madness, they better prepare themselves when they have a chance to do it. So that's in a way the argument in the book. Started from below, but then the broad opening came after the political changes at the end of 1976.
Let me put it this way. I agree completely with my dear brother on this. The dynamics and the driving force and of the reform and opening up, first and foremost from the power from below. Melinda, let me first, before getting to this, let me just respond to what you have said. I have read you for so long.
Oh,
I have known you for so long, and finally this time we have this opportunity. And the book is about Chinese, historical experience that finally become what is called the Great Project of Reform and Opening Up in the long 1970s. And so for the long 1970s, it began with the Cultural Revolution. And the Cultural Revolution was basically a process in which the communist project of pursuit of modernity had been tested by everyday people's everyday experience. And it becomes so clear, throughout the process, repeatedly, that project failed the contest of people's everyday experience. And especially after the so-called Linbiao affair. And that the society-wide crisis of faith had been, there. And Arne and I, we have taught, I personally experienced that period. And I could feel surrounding us from a blind worship in Maoism, the Maoist design of modernity, to gradually disappointed. I told Arne, in 1968, 1969, as a Shanghai school-less high school student, we edited 2 collections of so-called collection of heterogeneous thought, right? How could that happen? And this is just myself. I'm just one of a billion of Chinese people at the time. And when we came to do the project, we found that in our both interviews and archival studies, and we find within the Chinese society, there were all kinds of protests, overt or covert, and this was so clear to the later stage of the Cultural Revolution, because we all remember the 1967 and 1976 Tiananmen incident. And this was period in our writing, we also mentioned everywhere there were, everywhere there was so-called rumor. And the person who was directly challenged was no one else but the chairman himself. And some kind of project that became outstanding in the reform and opening era actually had their roots in the Chinese countryside, in Chinese cities, during later stage of the Cultural Revolution. So you cannot just explain the occurrence of China's great project of reforming, opening up by examining the forces from above. You will have to examine what was happening in the larger society, in the everyday people's everyday experience. What had changed?
thank you so much. I can feel the passion for this topic, and I think that one of the reasons why Arne and Chen Jian and I kind of feel a connection is that we all actually lived through some of this period. I first arrived here in Beijing to work in 1980, so it was still very much an uncertain post-Mao feeling. One of my first big stories was the trial of the Gang of Four. So today it's almost hard to understand it, but in those days it was very true that the benefits of reform actually were felt at the countryside level first, and urban city dwellers were very envious of the so-called peasants, because they were getting I wouldn't say really rich, but they were certainly improving their livelihood by leaps and bounds with the dismantling of the people's communes. But one thing you mentioned, Professor Chen, and I know Arne also pays a lot of attention to this, is the amazing wealth of sources. You talked about archives. I know you both have interviewed many, many, many people. And for those in the audience who haven't read this book, you've got to read this book. It'll be memorable for you, and not only because of its depth of expertise, but because of its details that make the stories come alive. You know, I'm a journalist, you're authors and academics, but as a journalist, I really appreciated some of those little stories, some of them even by people who could not be named, but with such granular detail that it really helped me understand and feel like I was living part of that experience. Other reviewers have also said the same thing about your book. Julia Lovell, in a review in the Financial Times, stated that, quote, almost every page contains an eye-opening detail. And she mentions that one thing that struck her was this little factoid that Lin Biao, in the middle of, you know, all the succession tensions going on as Mao was his health was declining, he had a phobia of pens that made him terrified, which I thought, you know, like, to be able to pick that fact out of, you know, all the conversations and all the archives, all the interviews and all the memoirs that have gone through, it's pretty incredible. So Arne, let me ask you first, who between the two of you, or is it both of you, who came up with all these great details and had the idea to put them in there? Because academics don't always think they belong in there, right? But they're in there, and I think for the ordinary reader, they really make a difference.
I'm glad to hear you say that, Melinda. I mean, I think both Chen Jian and I are sort of natural storytellers. We're the kind of historians who like to tell history the way we see it, not just come up with an overall, possibly correct, but still sometimes rather dry analysis, which some of my colleagues prefer, at least when they start up their projects. We like to tell stories, and we like to tell them because we like people who are not academics to read these books. I mean, what is the purpose of just writing a book if you write for your colleagues? And this is very much a book like that, which has been true, I think, for all that Chen Jian and I have done, at least for the last 30 years. So that's another reason, of course, why Professor Chen is the ideal collaborator from my perspective on this. We both like to tell stories. But this also says something, Melinda, about the possibilities and the constraints of doing detailed research in China now on history as on almost anything else. So here in the United States, or in the United States where I usually work, there are quite a lot of people who are saying, oh, you can't do research in China today. It's impossible. You know, it's too restricted. And of course, there are restrictions and there are problems, and things are not the way they should be with regard to research. But at least for most of the time, when Professor Chen and I researched this book, it was possible to do some kinds of research. You have to do it carefully. You have to do it very painstakingly because you want to make sure that you get these things right. Particularly as we do, not for a big part of the book, but for some smaller points, we have to operate with anonymous sources because of the situation at the moment. It's even more important to have that double and triple checked so that we know that we get it right. And that's what we were able to do. The interviews played quite a bit of a role. These were interviews that we had gathered over a long period of time with people who have profound insight into what was going on, either because they were there themselves in quite a few cases, actual eyewitnesses to some of what we talk about. You will remember, having read the book, Melinda, that we have a pretty in-depth description of what happens in the Zhongnanhai on the night when Mao Zedong dies. And that's based, of course, on material that we got access to, but it's also based on speaking to people who are actually there and have some memory of what it was like, and this terrible sense of fear that filled everyone when the man who had been running the party and governing China for such a long time suddenly was no more. So you know, you have to be able to pick these kinds of things up. It's not easy in China these days. But the idea that it's impossible, I think, is something that we should not accept.
Let me just add, actually, the book was published in 2024. However, the preparation for doing the book began much, much earlier. And Arne and I were fortunate enough to have caught the golden age of China's archival opening. Basically in the first decade of 21st century, it was quite possible to access all kinds of archival documents, especially from provincial, archive. Let me just share a personal story which involved the current top leader of China. And that was in the summer of 1999, and with two colleagues from Shanghai. And we went to Fujian archive to try to do archival research. And the archives were declassified. But it's difficult to see them, and even more difficult to make copies. And it so happened that one of the colleagues was a childhood buddy of the Fujian acting governor at that time. So we went to see him. And at first he was very nervous. He thought that that was the time the smuggled commodity in Fujian become a kind of a very desirable, stuff for many. And you need to find someone in power to get a special, Tiao's permission to get access to them. So the government thought that could we come there for this purpose? When he heard that we actually would like to open the door of the archive, he was great. You can see the kind of sense of relief from him. He asked his secretary to call the archival director to say, okay, we have 3 scholars from China to, from Shanghai to try to do archive, help them. So this was my first, actually Arne and I, this was right after we had the Cold War conference in Guilin, and Arne did not join us, but he was also in the background. So this was my first, most productive archival, research experience. And of course, the person's name is Xi Jinping. So in the following decade, in provincial archives, municipal archives, even foreign military archive, it was really possible to access quite a few, extremely valuable documentation, and especially at lower level. You can find it's there, and gradually the archive opening had reached such an extent. For example, probably people probably know the name Frank Dakota, and you probably know his book about history of the People's Republic of China. And I will say many of his specific arguments I do not necessarily agree. However, he also used the opportunity, golden age of archival opening in China, to have checked various Chinese provincial archives. And he absolutely not of Chinese origin, right? So this experience, unfortunately, stopped in the second decade of the 21st century. For example, Chinese foreign military archive started system opening. And open the system, adjusting, upgrading. Yes, upgrading, that's the word. Unfortunately, the upgrading process never ends.
Actually, that's a great segue into my next question. So I'll ask you first, Professor Chen, and then I'll ask Arne. Both of you, in your introduction, and in various places in the book, you suggest that the book that was produced was not exactly the book that you thought you would be producing when you first began. Partly it's because it was over a long period of time, and now it's clear that partly it's because there were things that were open then that are not as accessible now. And were there also people who you talked to and then they either asked you not to write about what they told you, or they wanted to be anonymous, or they even changed their story or pretended they didn't tell you what they told you? Did you have any of those kinds of experiences?
In my memory, I cannot say, cannot remember anyone who tried to say, do not, I changed the content of my story. However, obviously, China has changed. You probably find the two chapter, topic. One is to the point of no return with a very big question mark. And then the conclusion, the making of Chinese reform. And we and Arne and I had a lot of discussion, especially is it still applicable, relevant to name a chapter to the point of no return. And after much discussion, we decided to still keep it, but with a big question mark. Because in many aspects, the long 1970s and China's whole reform and opening project indeed had brought the country to the point of no return. It is next to impossible for China to return to the Maoist era. Chinese society had changed. Chinese mindset had changed. Chinese middle class. And this is not about wealth. This is not about a number. This is about their definition of the relationship between rights and power. That had changed. No one can undo those changes. But at the same time, of course, much of the process and result of the reform and opening had been shifted to a different direction. But did that mean the reform and opening up had been completely undone? You just read the Chinese official discourse. They never say that. So in official discourse, no one today, no matter how powerful, dare to say that I want to undo the reform and opening. You still see the deepen reform and continue opening. And this actually is the dilemma and the paradox that China is facing. So I think this is extremely important to note. So to come back to Melinda, your question, what have changed? Of course, we are historians. We are not just living in a vacuum, circumstances. We must try to understand how any history is contemporary history, how the current situation had influenced our writing of history. So in that sense, yes, and even though much of the story itself has not changed, but our representation of the story will have to follow what we think will be made relevant to our approach toward today and even to the future.
Thank you very much. Arne, I'd like to also hear your response to this. And also, maybe let me add one other thing. In the very beginning of your book, the introduction actually, the two of you acknowledge that this is not a story of victorious progress. It's also a story of how the Communist Party kept its power, how dreams of social equality and justice were defeated, how women and young people were marginalized, and ultimately about how urban areas triumphed over rural ones in the wake of what most people had seen back in the 1930s and 1940s as a peasant revolution. So Arne, part of my question to you is additionally, is this very much an unfinished story? When you began, did you think maybe it was more clearly on a certain path, and then partway through, did you say, "Oops, maybe there's been a slight detour here," or tell me if I'm wrong? I'm.
Yeah, that's a great question, Melinda. So as Chen Jian said, we worked on this book off and on for a fairly long time. I mean, it was connected to other research projects that each of us were doing. Was relatively late in the game that it came together in the exact sort of format structure that it has now. But we had been looking at this for quite some time. I don't think either of us expected China politically to be where it is today when we started looking at this material. But that said, we also see, I think now, writing it, as Chen Jian rightly said, from 2023, 2024, when we finished the book, very different world from many of the issues that we discuss in this text. We saw it as a move that was connected in many ways to what happened during the end point of our story. We do believe that by the mid-1980s, those trends that you just referred to were pretty much set out. They deepened, they became in many ways more problematic, more controversial later on. They do not take away from the reform process as a period of tremendous and mostly successful economic change, but they do delimit it. They do put it in a perspective where I think particularly younger people in China today realize that there were holdover problems from that time period that their generation somehow will have to deal with. Issues of inequality, issues of participation of all sorts, not just political participation, but participation in a broader sense. Gender relations, a lot of various aspects that were left over from that time period because so much of the Chinese people were cut out politically from what happened during this process. And that's something we regret. So we chose to draw on Carl Polanyi's great book on the Great Transformation, dealing with very different issues, mainly back in the 19th century. For that reason, I mean, Polanyi's conclusion is very similar to ours. I mean, the idea that markets, the introduction of markets, is historically speaking necessary, is something that comes out of a past in which there is only one path forward. That's the view that Polanyi critique, and that's the view that we critique as well. We see many of the economic choices made as being profoundly contagious. But we also see some of the political choices made as being contagious for this time period. And we also see the issues that are connected to this as being issues of choice. So let me finish by just where you started with your first question, Melinda. I think there were people who we worked with who provided information who towards the end of our work with the book would not necessarily be quoted in person. But that was about as far as it went. I think Chen Jian is entirely right in saying that people didn't change the story. I mean, people generally don't do that. I mean, it's their story, it's their lives, and they have their views of that. But appearing openly in terms of providing input for a book like this had become more difficult, I would say, for some people as we approached the date when the book was published.
Thank you. And I want to open this up to questions because we've got a fantastic audience here with some great thinkers among the attendees. Let me just ask one final question, and we can deal with this quickly if you want. Arne, why don't we start with you, because this is a question for both of you, because each of you have come to this book having done a previous book about the Cold War. Arne, you did the global Cold War. Chen Jian, you did Mao's China and the Cold War. Looking at the world today, especially even just in recent months, how things have changed and become more uncertain, are there some analogies here? In your book, you mentioned that Mao himself, in one of the most transformational decisions that he made before he passed away, which was to seek a rapprochement with the United States, you said that he did that because he thought opening a conversation with the Americans might save the Chinese Revolution. You quoted, you stated that China was very isolated at that time. It had picked fights with not only its closest neighbors, but also both of the all of the major powers, and was rudderless. That was the word you used domestically. And Mao himself believed that the Soviet Union was gearing up for a sneak attack on China. Not only that, he thought a world war was on the horizon, and he wondered if Moscow would attack China as the opening salvo of that. Are there any analogies here? People are kind of worried, and the word war is being bandied about a lot more now than it was just a few months ago, or certainly years ago. What do you think, Arne?
So I do think, well, I do think, Melinda, that I mean, you can learn from history. I mean, they're not, in a way, certain set in stone lessons that covers all times and all situations. But I think you can learn quite a bit from history. I mentioned before we went on today that the book that I've just finished is a small book comparing international affairs in the early 20th century to international affairs now, where I unfortunately see many parallels. Chen Jian is just updating his great book on the origins of the Second World War. So clearly there are some parallels that you can see from history. With regard to great power constellations or reconstellations, I do think it is important to think about the period that we cover in this book, both with regard to what that opened up for. So, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that Mao's security-based decision to pull closer to the United States later on, and for reasons that he would not have agreed with, made it easier for China to go through the kind of reform and opening up that we have talked about earlier on. There is no doubt about that. That was not what Mao had in mind, but that's how it worked out. But we also have to be very clear that that isolation that China had gone through had also left most of the country, including the country's leadership, behind in terms of understanding how the outside world worked, right? So that's a sort of double misunderstanding in a way here. I'm interested in hearing what Chen Jian has to say about this, having just finished his great Zhou Enlai biography. But Mao's view was not just that there would be another world war, and relatively soon, and he held to that view till his dying day. But also that the United States was the weakening superpower and the Soviet Union was the one on the rise, which turned out not to be correct when you got into the following decade. So, I think one of the lessons we can draw from that for today is that the kind of pattern in international politics that we see today is not necessarily going to be the one that will be predominant in the immediate future. I mean, I, for one, believe that we talk about some people talk about the new Cold War between China and the United States. Not me, I disagree with that perspective, but some people do. I'd rather say it this way. I mean, I think both the United States and China have deep structural problems that they need to resolve in order to be able to fully develop the way that people want it to develop. It's not just about great power rivalries where you can learn from the past, but it's also about what happens internally and domestically and the kind of situation that is necessary for a great power to manifest that power on an international stage.
Thank you.
The Cold War is not just a normal, confrontation of different international forces. This is really about different paths toward modernity. Global communism versus global capitalism. And it was represented at one point by two different camps. Today, let me put this way boldly, internationalism as communism, international communism as an alternative path compared with global capitalism and toward modernity or beyond is dead. Is China today still a communist country? read Xi Jinping's initial aspiration or ultimate mission. It has nothing to do with communism. It's called to seek happiness for the Chinese people, to pursue rejuvenation of the restoration of China's great power status. Basically, it's Chinese version of it's a Chinese version of make something great again. Right? So no matter to what extent, we now, you know, Francis Fukuyama's end of history has been laughed at. But one thing I think remains correct. We are today still in the age of a different format of global capitalism. China today, no matter to what extent, as far as China is still an integral part of global production chain, is still part of global market, to not to what extent people say decoupling or whatever. And still, it is a kind of monkey, Shen Wukong king, who is unable to jump out of the palm of the Buddha, which is global capitalism. If that is the case, how could the world be brought back to something called the Cold War? It's different.
Thank you.